Welcome to the Hudson Institute. My name is Josh Block. I'm an adjunct fellow at the Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today. And I'm honored to welcome our guests. Mohammed Baharoon is the co-founder and director general of the Dubai Public Policy Center, Bahut. And Lior Weintraub is a former Israeli diplomat, former spokesman for the Israeli embassy in Washington, former chief of staff to a couple of ambassadors, and is currently a political consultant and a commentator in Israel. And of course, we're joined by one of Israel's leading journalists, Attila Somfalvi, who is one of the top political journalists and anchors on television there and on radio as well for Ynet. And we're really honored to have the three of you with us today to discuss events in the Middle East, including the new government in Israel, its implications for the region, relationships between Israel and its Arab neighbors and the Arab Accords, the Abraham Accords, and of course what's going on in the UAE and its leadership in the region of late. So again, very honored to have each of you here and to have all of you joining us. Thank you. Mohammed, let's start with you. You're in Dubai. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the climate there? And as you're observing Israel's elections, and you guys have been a leader in the Abraham Accords, how you're thinking about the region at the moment and Israel's new government? Do you see it as an opportunity? Is it any change at all for the UAE? Is it a consistent matter? How do you look at that?
First of all, thank you very much, Josh, for the invitation, and I'm honored to be among this very distinguished panel. Let's talk about the Abrahamic Accord. The Abrahamic Accord is seen as a regional mechanism. It's not a bilateral relationship. That's why the name is Abrahamic Accord. That's why two Gulf states have signed it with Israel. That's why the signing was in Washington, D.C. Therefore, it is not seen as an agreement with one specific government. It's an agreement with the Israeli people with a purpose to address this continuous, very long tension and conflict in the region. And from that point of view, it's the view to the Abrahamic Accord, the strategic value of the Abrahamic Accord might not change drastically based on a certain elected government from particular political orientation to another. However, in any country that undergoes election and new team come to the government with different priorities, there might be a need for a re-engagement on alignment and sort of a revision. Why did we do this in the first place, and where do we want to go with it? And I think that is the view right now. The partnership, I assume, as I understand, as I see, as evident by declarations and statements, is a long-term relationship. It's not a short-term relationship. And it's a regional mechanism. It's not a bilateral. And I think that would give it more sustainability in the future. However, that sustainability, the value of it would be judged based on how far can it go? And do we want it to be limited to just a bilateral agreement based on, let's say, trade, security, or do we actually see the full value of a much more wider regional movement towards peace and integration in the region?
Well, that's excellent. Thank you. Lior, as you listen to the things that Mohammed is saying, and you consider the kind of the value of the Abraham Accords, which, by the way, underwent the stress of the conflict with Hamas recently, and of course the changing government, and you hear very positive things from the Bennett-Lapid leadership about the Abraham Accords. And of course, Ram is a part of this government. It seems to me in part that change inside Israel is somewhat reflective of the change in the region, where you have an Arab party for the first time, part of Israel's governing coalition, and not just any Arab party, Lior, but an Islamist party that has turned away from the rejectionism of other Salafists and other Islamists, and has decided to focus on citizenship and participation and potholes and quality of life for Arab citizens of Israel. How do you view these things regionally, and is there a connection between the two?
Well, thank you, Josh. Glad to be with all of you here today. I would, with your permission, I want to try and first of all observe what's going on the inside of Israel, and then try to go the outside, since you cannot belittle the change that is undergone, that took place in Israel since the formation of this government. We need to bear in mind that 12 years of Netanyahu left their mark in every field, on every Israeli, both positively and some people see it very negatively, but in every aspect of life of every Israeli. There are many Israelis that are, lived only, they knew only of Netanyahu government. So the change is dramatic, but at the same time, this doesn't necessarily mean, or probably doesn't mean there is a dramatic change in the policies that we will see this government promoting and executing. So the Abraham Accords obviously are on the good side of every Israeli. If you ask every Israeli on the street, in the government office, what are the three main events, strategic events of recent years, they'll say these agreements are probably will be number one. And so I see a continuation and even efforts to keep on promoting and pushing. And these are an accord that are, although the relationship with Jordan and Egypt are still very strategic, probably the closest one and the most important one, but these are kind of new agreements where Israelis feel the warmth, they see the fruits of peace immediately. They appreciate it. They can imagine what real peace feels like, what the real opportunities look like. Now, if I'll go back in for a minute, obviously, for the first time, we see that an Arab party is not just participating in the coalition, is also the kingmaker. There's a strategic role in this government. And I think what we saw from Mansour Abbas is very pragmatic approach, the kind of approach that every Israeli who believes in coexistence and in strengthening the fabric that is Israel, basically, would like to see in here. And this wouldn't have happened unless Netanyahu and the Likud were the first one to engage and give legitimacy to this partnership. Obviously, this whole government stands on very thin legs, or stands on a very narrow majority in the government, and we're going to see tremendous challenges on a daily basis. Actually, we're now heading, and Attila probably will want to say a few words about it, toward a full-fledged crisis on these issues that every Arab party within the Knesset sees as very dear, and these are the kind of issues that are in the fraction, and this is the issue of family reunification between Palestinians living in the West Bank and Israelis within Israel.
So, as you mentioned, it is an amazing turn of events that you have the region itself coalescing, as Mohammed alluded to, into a unified way, which is a long time coming, but certainly intuitive. And then, at the same time, you've got these changes inside Israel, which are themselves dramatic, and of course came, from my perspective, the Abraham Accords and the changes in Israel represent pretty much an existential threat to the rejectionist camp, to Iran, to Hamas, to the Muslim Brotherhood, who when they see these changes are alarmed. And so, 24 hours before that government that was just formed was initially to be formed, the war with Hamas broke out. I didn't take that as a coincidence, honestly. And then I looked again, several weeks later, and there again, we've got the government formed, and they're attempting to send balloons and create more havoc. So obviously, there's something happening here that is substantial and is causing tremors across the region in these other players. So it's fascinating to watch and amazing to see. And then secondly, it is though fragile. Primarily inside Israel. I think we've seen that the Abraham Accord seems a little more stable outside, but internally, the situation in Israel is political and just like the United States, quite divided. It took how many elections, Attila, to get to the outcome? 4?
Yeah, we had 4 elections in 2 years. First of all, thank you so much for hosting me and having me. I apologize for being on the move, but this is how it goes here in Israel at this time. We had 4 elections in 2.5 years. Yeah, that was crazy. The instability in the Israeli system brought us to a situation where 8 different parties from the right, the left, and the center, Jews and Arabs, they decided to work together in order to make the system work again. And you've been asking about the accords. I think there's no such thing that is stronger than the consensus around the accords. Every Israeli, whether he's Jew, Hasidic, Haredic, or whatever, the atheist, every Israeli thinks that the accords are a great asset, and everybody is in love with the idea of being part of the family of nations here in the Middle East. Therefore, when you have a foreign minister like Yair Lapid, who is not only in love with the idea of peace, but it's also devoted to the idea of peace, especially in the region. I remind you that 7 years ago, when he was in the government, he was the one pleading to go and have an agreement, a diplomatic agreement around Gaza after another operation in Gaza, right? In order to make Gaza and the people living there have a better life. So he's committed and he's devoted to these agreements, as is every other minister in this government. That's for the accords. As for the political system in Israel, it's still shattering. I don't think we are stabilized yet. We will have to see how this government, how this coalition that is based on parties that are between 4 and 17, 17 being the largest number of MKs in the Yesh Atid party, and this is unbelievable, by the way, how this government can perform and make decisions. And Lior mentioned it. The decision-making system has to be refined all the time, because Israel is not a normal state, and the issues that are on the table are always, how should I put it, substantial, and they're always cardinal for everybody. There is no little issues here in Israel. Everything is dramatic all the time. So we will have to see pretty soon, I guess, how this coalition and how this government can work together. Just today, we are dealing with a small crisis in the government, not between Jews and Arabs, but between Jews between themselves. The defense minister Gantz just offered to have a committee that will investigate the submarines from 3-4 years ago. If you remember this crisis that we had here, that's a few years ago, regarding the submarines that were bought by Israel from the Germans. And Justice Minister Gideon Saar is opposing that right now. So there is a clash in the government on issues that were a consensus during the elections. So I'm not going to be a prophet, and I'm not going to tell you exactly how everything is going to work, because I'm so curious, exactly as you are, to see how Prime Minister Bennett is going to form a system that will make people work together and not fight together from day to night. Every day.
Fascinating. That's fascinating. Thank you for that commentary. You know, I want to ask you, not in a flippant way, Mohammed, but in a meaningful way. You know, as you watch Israel's democracy go, and I would say function, you know, it obviously works pretty well. You have 4 elections. You know, you've got a very vibrant political culture, but sometimes these issues and this tension plays itself out. From your perspective, you know, where where the UAE and Dubai operate so seamlessly, it feels like most of the time. How do you look at this process of kind of sausage making, so to speak?
I'm not in a position to make a comment on any political system, actually. But what I would say is that we don't look, I mean, talk about myself. I don't look at how a political system operates. I look at its, you know, outcomes. And if those outcomes are actually something that has a certain degree of stability, of rationality, it has you know, a good impact on people. For other countries, it's something that you can deal with, and there is a certain level of expectancy, so you can see how things can evolve. Then that would make relationship much easier with each other. just like, driving in the street. So you assume that everyone is going to, be on their lane. If people start moving across lanes, then things become, hectic. So Shakespeare used to say, all's well that ends well. And I think that's the concept of outcome. Regardless how a decision is being made, is that being made by voting, is that being made by consultation, if that's being made by one visionary leader, as long as those calls at the end mean something and have an impact on people, people can expect it, can work with it, I think that is absolutely fine. But having said that, there is an issue of, let's say during election times, electioneering becomes an issue. So you're not quite sure if these are done because of a strategic rationale or because of a tactical reason at a certain issue. And I think that what, can throw people off at certain points. If I understand that this is a decision that you're going to take, an action, a statement that is going to contribute to the overall strategic objective on the long run, and that's something I respect. But if you do this, you don't really mean it, but you need to do something or achieve something right now, might not be worthwhile and 3 months later, then that would throw people off. And I think it's a learning curve for everyone.
That's very wise. I mean, I think trying to interpret people's political rhetoric is a challenge, in the most normal of times and in the most simple political environments. So riddling Israel is definitely a challenge. Lior, you've been involved there both on the diplomatic side and on the political side. How do you see the sort of the, my sense is that, I know you talk about this government has a 1-vote margin, but it seems to me that both Bennett and Lapid have an interest in maintaining the government and maintaining some sense of stability. They have, as I understand it, a mutual veto kind of over each other. They seem to have divided the labor a little bit. Lapid, the United States, and Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, and Bennett, kind of, internal leadership. Or what is the division of leadership as you see it? How will this government attempt to operate and to manage those coalitions and its relationships in the region and outside?
So I think some of the issues that you mentioned are still, I think both of them are still learning and investigating themselves. But I see there was some deep thinking how to create a sort of mechanism to de-escalate these kind of situation where, especially when, just an external challenge, or if the opposition booby-trap this government into a vote on the floor against the ideology of one of the components of this government, how do you deal with it? So recently, it was published that they brought more lawyers into the team to deal with these issues. How do you interpret the coalition agreement? How do you find the legal ways to bypass these hurdles? I'm not sure that the division of labor between Lapid and Bennett is one will be dealing with the world and the other one internally. I just says for the first time, Attila mentioned it, for the first time there is a real full-time foreign minister, and part of his job is to go and engage and lead Israeli diplomacy. I'm not sure that.
Lior, can I just pause there a second? When you say there's a full-time foreign minister, can you tell people who are watching and may not know what you mean, what you mean?
So in the last few years, there weren't part of the last 5 years, Netanyahu was both prime minister and foreign minister. Later, we saw ministers that were called as foreign minister, but in the de facto, the prime minister was Netanyahu. At the same time, we saw many of the duties of a traditional foreign ministry were delegated to other ministries, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, Ministry of Diaspora, ministers without portfolio got some pieces of the ministry. So it was weakened dramatically. And of course, when you look at the budget of the ministry, you saw that it was deprived of most of its operational budget, which kind of crippled it from actually engaging in real diplomacy with, you mentioned the Democrats and the progressive community in the US. So definitely this was a very visible outcome of this situation. I would like to say, so I think we'll see later on Bennett engaging with President Biden and with administration, with Congress, and it will be a challenge. It will be a real challenge how a prime minister that is is holding only 6 seats at the Knesset, and his government is very diverse. How does this thing walks and talks in the international community? This brings me to the next point, that this government is, when you think about, if you measure governments with their ideology or worldview, this government is a midget, right? But when you look at their ability to execute what we call here work for
again. What was the word?
Life itself. How do you deliver for the life of the life of ordinary Israeli when it comes to communication, transportation, health, and education? Then this government potentially is a giant. Now, policy is a derivative of these 2 poles, and it would be interesting to see it. How can you develop a policy which usually is the outcome of worldview when you don't agree on the ideology at all? So it would be very interesting. Another point, if I have another 10 seconds, Josh, is at the same time, we see a very dangerous campaign to delegitimize this government. We see it starts with the way that some members of the Likud bloc is referring to Bennett as not as in his first name, not as a prime minister. The way that there is a very quiet and sophisticated delegitimization campaign. Now, as long as this government will keep on going and will show results, it will be safe. It will stand. The minute it will stop cycling, then this campaign might be effective, even lethal.
You know, I'm glad you raised that. It's interesting. Attila, I wanted to ask you about that. You know, I know some folks who are Israeli and close observers of Israeli politics, and they have expressed to me more alarm than I felt, let's say, about the rhetoric of some of the Haredi rabbis and some of the folks on the right of the spectrum, who they say are saying things that sound very reminiscent of the Rabin era, if you will. You know, that is alarming. Is Israeli society in the same place as it was? Was Yigal Amir a product of his own insanity, or was he really driven told by someone what to do? I mean, you know, I'm not commenting on those things, but I do think it is interesting, and I wonder what you think about these political tensions. Are they as meaningful as they were back then? What is the impact of this stuff?
Well, I just want to give you a small example. The chief of the Shin Bet, the Shabak, he published a very rare annunciation, saying a message, saying, listen, you have to calm down. This message that was published by him, by Nadav Argaman, was totally unexpected, because he never did it again, never did it before, and no one before him did it. And he was calling the politician to calm down the discussion, the discourse, the public discourse. He asked them actually to lay down, to step down, to calm down. Everything was on fire here. Now, you mentioned the religious rabbinic leadership. At some point, 3 weeks ago, it seems like prehistoric times here in Israel, because everything is so fast and is flying away. Like 3 weeks ago, people were on the streets. It felt like we are going towards a civil war at some point. So yes, the fear was high. I can't tell you exactly, it was exactly like 25 years ago with Rabin, right? Or 26 years ago. But there was a feeling here that everything that the leadership is losing control. And maybe it had a purpose, and it was done by purpose, to lose control and to say, well, listen, what can I do? This is how people react to this not legitimate, as Lior said, new government. And the press was also very alerted about how it looked like. So I can't compare exactly the narratives, but I can compare the atmosphere. And the atmosphere here it was warlike at some point.
Well,
it was very heavy.
It does seem different in that as you say, that the Shabak and the political, the sort of establishment understood what was happening and said, stop, and put a lid on it.
At some point, and not everybody, Josh, not everybody, because they tried to waste time as long as they could. And it took Netanyahu a lot of days, many days, a lot of time to get out there and say, calm down, people, calm down. This is not our way. Israel is a democracy. People can say and do whatever they want as long as they're cited by the law. So it took some time, and there was a fear. I had to tell you, it was unprecedented since Rabin, that some political players, and I'm not going to name names right now, and or finger point, but there was a feeling that some political players are trying to actually light the streets on fire. Streets on fire.
It does go to show the depth of the meaning of the change that you see inside Israel and regionally, and maybe it's not just an existential challenge or a real challenge to Iran and Hamas, but to those who have been resisting some of these changes inside Israel. Lior, how do you react to that?
So first of all, I think it's really worth mentioning that the fact that going back to the Abrams Accord, I think the UAE and others passed the first hurdle in the relationship in flying colors. Because in recent years, even when there was a rapprochement and some sort of engagement, the minute Hamas would provoke Israel, and Israel would have retaliated, and then they would have retreated and say, all right, we will come back later. But here we see that the interests and the joint interests and even the common values and the relationship people to people and government relations kind of we're holding very strong in light of the uneasy pictures coming from Gaza. And this brings us also to Hamas and to Iran. Again, I don't see any government. There is a growing consensus or understanding that the situation vis-a-vis Iran, when we look at what's going on, the negotiations that the Biden administration is holding with Tehran, and with the general assessment where the project is, we know that we don't have time. And we might be in a position where, again, we will need to decide how to respond to an agreement that might be slightly better from the JCPOA, or maybe even worse. So I think it's interesting because what holds one of the Iran is a very good glue to the relationship between Israel and the Gulfis, and the Likud opposition, first and foremost Netanyahu, is the best glue for this new government.
Mohammed, the events of the region are dynamic. You've got, as the guys described, you've got this change in Israel, which is real and meaningful. But of course, Israel is a young country; it's going through its own internal spasms of change, and yet, the challenges, the security challenges, principally from Iran and its allied groups, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen or Hezbollah or in Iraq. These are things that are a chief concern. And this discussion here in the United States about going back into the JCPOA is not only about just the JCPOA, it's about Iran's economy and giving them potentially billions of dollars in cash and returning them to the economic fold in the international community, which would again strengthen them and give them more money to invest in Hezbollah and Hamas and these other nefarious things. How do you look at the process of negotiation with Iran both in terms of its conventional the concerns about its conventional capabilities, and the nuclear project, its nuclear pursuit. These things that, you know, neither one is disconnected from the other. How do you approach it? How do you think people in the UAE see Iran at the moment?
We're shifting gears, so to speak, right now to Iran. But before we do, I will take the point that you made. I think it's worth consideration, which is the Abrahamic Accord becoming some sort of an existential threat to Iran.
Yeah.
And I want to dwell on this. I agree with you, but with a caveat. The Abrahamic Accord is an existential threat to what Iran does in the region, not to Iran itself as a country. Mm-hmm. And it can be that if it achieves its full potential, which is arrive at a peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Because if that happens, that means neither Iran nor other groups like Qaeda, Daesh, Muslim Brotherhood can use religion to promote hatred to another country, such as Israel. So in that sense, it is an existential threat to what it represents. Its ability to promote hatred, to justify hatred in this region is based on that. And actually Iran's influence in the Arab region is based on the claim of defending the Haram al-Sharif. And once that is sorted out, that claim is not there, and therefore Iran cannot justify asking people to either curse Israel or the US or ask the damnation, because that is out of the contest. So and that, once it achieves its full potential, then definitely it's an existential threat. Now let's go back to Iran economy and the JCPOA, and I agree with you, they are interconnected. But from the point of view of the UAE, again, I'll go back to the Abrahamic Accord. We look at the Abrahamic Accord as the regional mechanism, but the regional mechanism to achieve what? Two things. One, political deconfliction, which means sort out, dilute all of those areas of conflict from a conflict of identity, which it's a zero-sum equation, to an actual political discussion where people can reach compromises. The second part is the economic integration. And by integration, it has to be regional. It cannot be bilateral. And I would remind you that the 4 countries that have signed the Abrahamic Accord so far, UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, none of them share borders with Israel. Mm-hmm. There's no direct borders, which means without the full regional approach, the meaning of that accord is going always to be challenged. As far as Iran is concerned, economy for Iran is something that we would like. Honestly, we would want Iran to thrive. One of my personal, views is that the one thing that I would love to see coming out of Iran is, a transformation plan similar to the 2030 Saudi, transformation plan. Something that says, we are focusing on our development of our people. We're going to change Iran in the same way Saudi has changed itself. We're going to reinvent our position, and we're going to use economy to become meaningful, not only to the Iranian people, but to the region and the world at large. Now, that would be music to my ears. But until now, we haven't seen any type of sign that what Iran is doing right now is geared towards establishing itself, for instance, not only as an economic powerhouse, but also a partner in regional economic integration. Most of the energy is going somewhere else. And I think that is something we will need to consider. I have personal views about the JCPOA. And quite often, JCPOA is being presented as something that will stop Iran from obtaining a bomb. And that's why it's very important for us to achieve it. But my counter argument is that JCPOA did not stop Iran from getting a bomb. And when Iran wants to evade those, it can evade it. And to give you an example from the Islamic practice, JCPOA is like fasting. If you're fasting, people don't know that you're fasting because it's between yourself and God. I mean, nobody knows whether you had a sip of water alone in the room. This is something where self, observation, and it's your direct relationship with God. Unlike, for instance, prayer. If you don't go to the mosque at the prayer time, pray with everyone, people know that you're not praying. Fasting is different. JCPOA, just like that. If Iran does not want to observe, it can do that. And people blame Trump for withdrawing from the JCPOA. I think the withdrawal have shown the real default in the JCPOA, that if Iran does not want to observe it, it can easily not observe it. If it wants to turn the cameras off, it can easily turn the camera off. If it wants to increase enrichment, it can easily increase. There is no power of refrain. And sanctions, no sanctions, nothing is going to affect it. So, and I'm sharing my own personal views as an observer rather than views of even my organization.
Attila, we see that you've arrived. Thank you. How do you look at the question of these defense issues? Is this government focused on internal matters, or is it because of its broad nature, essentially focused on kind of the Abraham Accords and strengthening regional relationships and addressing Iran issues? I mean, how do you look at that?
In Israel, you can't avoid any of these issues. You have to be all the time hands-on on everything. You have to be all the time hands-on on everything. And when I say everything, I mean Iran, I mean the Palestinians, I mean the Egyptians, I mean Gaza, I mean Lebanon, I mean Syria, I mean everything. You have to be all the time in direct connection, right? In direct connection with the problems that Israel has to deal with on the security level. Now, of course, the declaration made by the leaders of the parties forming the government, it was, we have to deal with the internal problems. We are after the corona. Israel has to deal with economic problems. So we'll focus on that. I can tell you one thing. This government is not gonna solve the Palestinian issue. I'm repeating that. This government is not gonna solve. But historically, neither did Netanyahu. And either did Olmert and Barak and Sharon. Nobody did that. Rabin tried, Peres tried, and that's it. In the past 20 years, all the diplomatic efforts in order to solve the Palestinian issues, they went down the drain. I mean, nobody had success. Therefore, they are very smart guys. Lapid, Bennett, Lieberman, they are all smart guys. They know that they don't have and they don't need, there is no pressure from Israelis, from the Israeli public to go and try and, renew the peace process. We'll see what the Biden administration wants to do with this issue. But from Israel internally, nobody is pushing them. Peace Now, like the organization, is not going to bring out 100,000 people shouting in Rabin Square, go and sign a peace agreement with the Palestinians. It's not on the table. It's not going to be on the table. The Palestinians are not going away. The security-wise, we have a problem. Demographically, we have a problem. Diplomatically, we have a problem. We just saw what happened in the world during our last operation in Gaza. Most of the people were very anti-Israelis. So there is a problem, but solving the problem, you're not going to see that in the next 2 to 4 years. And if this government survives and the glue that puts together all its parts is strong enough, they are going to try and solve other problems. Fortunately for them, the Israelis are not going to push them to do anything dramatic, to withdraw, to dismantle settlements, whatever. It's not on the table. So there is no.
Yeah, in some ways, Attila, it seems to me that in some ways, and Lior, maybe you can react to this, and we'll go to Mohammed, that presents an opportunity in a way, because it removes in some way from the discussion the most divisive issue among the parties, and then allows them to focus on things where there is common accord, no pun intended, like the Abraham Accords and expanding regional relationships or investing in some of these other areas, right? Lior, do you see
Exactly.
do you see a path for that? What are the areas of common ground, do you think, on a diplomatic basis? And then Mohammed, for you, does that give you some sense of optimism that you've got this diverse coalition that is outward facing? And where do you think that could go? Lior, with you.
So try and say the following. The Abrahamic Accord are deep in the consensus. I don't know any serious Israeli who has anything, even when there was a public discourse about whether these were, whether there was some sort of a linkage to the JSF deal or not. Still, I think there is a consensus that this is a major breakthrough. So developing the economic relationship, the people-to-people relationship, the culture exchange, and also the dialogue about the other issue. One of the things that I think that the UAE understood is that first you need the relationship, and then you can be heard. Then you can have influence over or a dialogue, a conducive dialogue with the leadership and with the public. Standing on the outside and with criticism and scolding will not promote, will not bring the Israeli party, the Israelis to move forward when there'll be an opening there for peace. The UAE can be a very powerful player by saying, this is the right direction to go. We encourage you to go there, even if there'll be risks. Obviously, when there's no opening, then nobody can persuade an Israeli prime minister or the Israeli public to take a leap of faith without even a vague knowledge that there is somebody on the other side. So I think that this is one of the areas where we can see a growth. We can see a development and also infrastructure for the day when the situation will be more mature to see some progress on the Palestinian arena. And going back to the Gaza operation, let's not forget that it started when Abbas canceled the elections in the PA. And there is a very strong linkage between events in Israel and events in the PA, and between the politics between the West Bank and Gaza, and it influences the Israeli arena immediately. And when the time will come and we'll see also a growing succession fights within the PA, we'll see violence towards Israel and Israelis, and we'll see more challenges in the relationship. Extremists will try to challenge these important accords.
Mohammed, I wanted to ask you something. The UAE is really an extraordinary leader in the region, but it does that from a place of, from my perspective, sort of subtlety. That may sound contradictory in a way, but it really seems to me to be one of the most effective players in guiding the region to a future. And you can contrast its leadership style with, say, Qatar's, whose policies are different as well, but who, acts differently, or others in the region who have different styles. How would you describe the sort of success of, or the philosophy of the leadership there to play an important leadership role in the Arab world and then in the region at large?
I think an analogy would be that our foreign policy is one guided on a number of principles that has been constant, which is the principle of stability. Stability is not peace. It's not democracy. It's not, stability is the minimum of being able to do business, connect with others, regardless of the differences that are there. But the analogy I would say is that we're more of a startup. So we start something new and use it as an experiment, and other people look at it and take the parts that they see more feasible to them. And I think that is the type of leadership, if you want to call it so. But this is what we're looking at. We see opportunities, we look ahead and try and get a trajectory of how things are moving. And based on that, we try and find a solution. But I would want to go back to what Attila said, which I think is very important, is that the real, issue on the ground is the peace and security of both Israelis and the Palestinians. And that, the involvement of regional actors through the Abrahamic Accords or otherwise is going to help create a good, environment for peace to be achieved. But it has to be achieved by the Palestinians and the Israelis. Mm-hmm. And I understand that, there are a lot of people who look at things differently. And in the same case, there are people like Hamas who wants to do things the hard way. There are also people inside Israel who wants to do things the very hard way as well. And it's natural is that if you've got this side, you've got people on the other side trying to do things. This is the type of balance. What I was hoping for the Abrahamic Accord to do, and I see resonance in what Lior was saying, is to expand the middle and make the fringes small and small. Mm-hmm. And I think that is what is happening. And to give you an example, the issue of annexation used to be a very important or big election currency. It's a political currency during election times. The last election, it was not as out there in your face, as prominent as it used to be, which means actually the middle is growing. Mm-hmm. And to give you another example of the outcome of the elections, if you compare the discourse about the Biden administration's elections, people were coming out with, the ABT, all but Trump. We haven't seen an all BN in Israel. There was a continuity. There was no, intention, at least obvious discourse, that we want to reverse everything that Netanyahu has done, even though people say that maybe it was not all good. But we haven't seen that, becoming very prominent, which shows, a degree of maturity. Mm-hmm. Now, what we're banking on as the UAE is that there is a real interest in peace. And that is something that is shared between the Palestinians. What we need to achieve is a viable how. How can we achieve that? And I think one of the things that we need to look at as things has changed and might have an impact is this huge transformation to the digital sphere. By the example of our meeting today, we're in different time zones, but we can be in the same way. Digital, assets are becoming even more important than physical assets. Can this have an impact on the way we're doing politics and in the way we're factoring in how we want to win and how we want to lose? What is land? What is identity? Where does it exist? Where do people exist? And how do they interact? I think that transaction or that transformation is going to have an impact. I don't think we have yet captured it in our political discourse.
Fantastic. Attila, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add just as an example coming in live during our discussion. As we speak at this moment right now, Israel is dealing with an outbreak of coronavirus with the Delta variant. And as we speak, we know that more and more Israelis have been infected. Now we are dealing with Palestinians and Iranians and security issues and so on. But the most urgent issue that's gonna be in front of this government, the new government, is the corona. It's not going away. It didn't vanish. So we are going back to square one, asking what are the main issues this government is going to have to tackle. They're going to be economical, they're going to be coronavirus, they're going to be healthcare and so on. There are so many things to deal with. Israel has gone through a tough period of time, as almost all the countries in the world. The economic system is still strong, but it has to be strengthened. And therefore, Bennett and Lapid are lucky in some ways, because they said it. We're not going to tackle Palestinian issues, no annexation and no peace deal. We have to deal with Israel inside, and Israel inside is knocking on doors.
It is interesting that, Mohammed, when you're hearing you talk about both the regional drive and these, it is true ultimately that, the environment in which the Palestinians and Israelis are able to make a peace accord is important. And the changes that are taking place in these relationships are the thing that will create that environment that makes it possible to do that with the support of Arab parties and it seems so logical. Why was it, do you think, that the conventional wisdom for so long, or the John Kerryism of the world, was there'll be never, ever, ever will there be peace with Arabs and Israelis when, when there's no peace yet with the Palestinians?
Look, I think peace needs sacrifice. And I don't think, the concept of conquest, the winner takes all, I don't think this is still going to be valid in the 21st century. And I think the smart people are the people who make the best deal possible. And I think this is the drive that is happening. But again, we can create the best environment ever. If those people directly involved don't want to achieve peace, don't see the value of peace, then and they don't want to invest in it, and by investing, I mean making a sacrifice for it. Any relationship is like that. A partnership in business or partnership in life, you will have to make sacrifices. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the type of sacrifice we are willing to make? I would also remind you that, in essence, the Abrahamic Accord is not different from the Arab, peace proposal. The difference is that during that proposal, the initiative wanted all for all. Get everything, all of the Arab nations for Israel. What we've started doing is, let's do it in piecemeal. So let's make a show of faith. Let's put a down payment towards it. Now, like any game show, you can answer the first question and take the first $100, or you can go on and win $1 million. What do you want? Do you want to take the small gain, and this is a possibility, or you can go for the big prize? And I think that's the big prize we're hoping for. My own personal view, again, I'm not in a position to dictate on the Palestinians or the Israelis what type of solution that they want to. But in my, personal views, if Israel wants to have its own, let's say, Jewish state, it will have to accept a two-state solution. If it wants a one-state solution, then it cannot have an identity, a specific identity that forces on the other. Again, the two-state solution is something that has been agreed during Oslo. So there has been an agreement on it. Now, the disagreement is on the how and the mechanics. There is not enough energy to go and focus on those mechanics. And I think now is the time for it again.
This has been a great discussion. We have about 2 minutes left. That was a great summation. I just want to give Attila or Lior anything that you guys want to add here at the end. Lior, go ahead.
So first, great discussion. Pleasure to be with you. I want to kind of pile on the example that Mohammed gave about the annexation. I think this is a very powerful lesson to every observer of the dynamic between Israel and its neighbor. When annexation was on the table, and annexation was a very extreme idea that was not present in the Israeli discourse for many, many years. But when it was on the table, there was no real effective pushback against it. It was the only idea in the arena, and it felt that it's about to happen. The minute there was a moderate alternative, it disappeared. So in order to fight extreme and bad idea, you need an alternative. And any alternative that will come from the region, take these 70,000 feet ideas of peace that is very elusive to something tangible people will see, feel emotionally. I think that it will help build bridges and take us forward to uncharted territories that now seem very, very, very far away. And as you said, the Palestinians are here. most of Israelis, all of Israelis, acknowledge the fact that we have conflicting narratives, that there'll be some sort of an arrangement. As you mentioned in the past, there was an understanding that we'll need to find some sort of agreement that will partition the land. It will hurt, but the Israeli public was there. Most of Israelis are still there, but they need to see what's on the other side and who's the partner, both from here, but also from here.
Well, you know, the images that have been coming out as a result of these accords are heartwarming, literally. I mean, I don't know how you guys feel, but when I see the images of Emirati students enrolling at, you know, at Herzliya at IDC, or Israelis visiting the Emirates, or, you know, emergency workers, you know, from the Emirates visiting with the Magen David Adom in Israel and learning and sharing ideas. I mean, these are the things that improve people's lives in meaningful and tangible ways. And it's just, it's terrific to see, you know, after so many years. It's so natural to watch, actually, when you see it happen. And so it's important to have leadership to bring it there. Attila, do you have any final words you want to share with us?
Yeah, one last remark before I say thank you and goodbye. You know, I was very almost you know, strict on saying that there's not going to be peace, but I want to remind you that there are too many players in the region that are going to try to see how far and how crazy is the new Israeli leadership. We have Hezbollah and we have Hamas, and they are going to try them. And don't forget that they always do that with new governments. So they are going to try to see what are the borderlines. How far can they go before they get struck by the IDF? That's one. And it can be dangerous. Second part, I want to remind you that Yair Lapid, and I said it before, he was a great fan of the idea of trying to bring back Gaza into a new order by engaging the Gulfies. And that was in the past. And I'm guessing that we'll see him and hear him saying that again, now that he's going to fly to Dubai and Abu Dhabi in a few days from now. He's going to try and bring in the moderate states in order to try and you know, reshape Gaza in some ways. And the new you know, the new narrative is, let's go after 12 years of strengthening Hamas. Let's go and try and weaken Hamas and bring in the PA, the Palestinian Authority, back to Gaza. Huge challenge, super interesting to watch.
Very. And yeah, that's a fantastic topic for our next discussion. No doubt. Mohammed, any last words before we part?
Just a thank you, and it was a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure, and I look forward to getting together again soon. Thank you all for joining us at the Hudson Institute today for this important discussion.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.